What is the crack, guys? It is Nathan here, aka the Rambling Kern and head instructor of the Kern School of Combat. So today I'm going to talk to you about the Irish fighting knife, also known as the skein, or sometimes the skein. So S-C-I-A-N or sometimes S-G-I-A-N, depending on where you're looking. So this is one of the probably most undervalued and understudied weapons, in my opinion, within the realm of Irish weaponry and Irish history, yet was a hugely popular and hugely influential weapon. So the term itself, skein, simply means knife, much like the Messer in Germany. The skein went on to refer to a specific type of knife. So what is that knife? Obviously you want to see it. And here we are. Here is a skein in a lovely leather scabbard. So this example is made by Tod of Tod's Workshop and Tod Cutler. This is part of his Cutler line. Amazingly affordable, really worth the value if you're looking to pick one up. Highly recommend them. This is, I don't think, based on any particular original, yet all of the specs are very close to the originals. So the kind of defining features of the skein, which is kind of across the lot of them, is quite a short handle, usually with some sort of disc guard. Not always, sometimes they flare. And most commonly, the thing that they all share is that they have a long, slender, kind of triangular blade with a very thick spine going to a single edge. So this is kind of unanimous across a lot of them. So to give you a bit of a closer look, here's the blade itself. So good thick spine, probably 2 or 3 centimeters right at the hilt here, and then tapering up to quite a narrow edge. So good distal taper on this one, as well as a good profile taper on it. Very simple but nice. The camera will focus. Here we go. Nice little brass and wooden guard. I'm not too sure of the wood, but I'll put a link on the video to this knife and to Tod's shop. Again, of all of the examples out there, this was one of the best looking and definitely the best value. So really highly recommend it. So getting back to what the skein is, so as I say, simply put, this is a knife. The term just refers to knife, yet in Ireland this came to be kind of the ubiquitous weapon of the Irish. So between the spear and this, those were kind of the most commonly seen weapons on the Irish battlefield for quite a long period. Now the origins of this, we don't really know. And if anyone is out there doing a doctorate or wants to go into any particular area of study, I really recommend looking into studying these. It's a hugely undervalued and understudied area. And also, just from looking through examples for this video and just through my own kind of pastimes, you'll see there's a huge amount of these that are very, very much miscategorized. So really one I would recommend people, if you have the opportunity, to spend some time looking into. So the skein itself, there's basically 3 primary types, and they basically are the small, medium and long versions. So this one from Tod, I would say, kind of falls into the realm of medium. Now I know when you're looking at this, you're kind of thinking that's quite a big knife, but the longer versions are about 1.5, sometimes even double the length of this. You see an example on screen now, which is 66 centimeters in total, or 56 in the blade. Or there's 2 examples in the Dublin Museum that are quite large, which I'll show now as well. So you also see this next slide of kind of a cross section of different skeins that are found in Ireland. And as you can see, they vary in size, but one thing that's common across a lot of them is that triangular blade profile, and pretty much all single edge. So you have quite a lot of the large ones, which are kind of recognized and studied, but you don't have many of the shorter ones. So This blade was made for me by Flett Forge in Scotland. Now, by request, I asked for these disc guards to be put on. This isn't really something that we'd see in a lot of skeins. The handle, however, is actually based on a find with the kind of little ring through the middle of it there. And the blade is almost an exact copy of one found in Tipperary. So as you can see, quite a thick spine going down to quite a wide blade to a good sharp, very sharp edge on this one. Interestingly, something that you actually see in a lot of period artwork for rondel daggers is that this is actually very forward heavy in the handle. So actually when you wear this, it almost dips forward. Probably won't be able to see there, but basically when you wear this, it almost dips forward this way. Sometimes, depending on how you have it tied up, it'll actually even dip downwards almost. So interesting thing, and something that you do see in a lot of period artwork. So the skein itself, it is kind of popular in Ireland for a good many hundred years, well, a few hundred years I should say. So the origins of it are very, very much unknown. There's a lot of theories around it. Paul MacDonald of MacDonald Armories in Scotland has a theory that I kind of tend to agree with, that he reckons a lot of these come from Scottish influence. So if you look at early Scottish dirks, generally very similar blade shape, not quite as narrow as a lot of the skeins, but usually single edge, sometimes some bevels, long straight blade, quite a thick spine coming into into quite a steep and narrow edge. Handle profiles and shapes are very similar. A lot of the wooden skeins that you actually see have very, very dirk-like handles, and there's a few that I have seen, in my opinion, miscategorized as Scottish dirks, which were probably Irish skeins. So I do kind of tend to agree with that. So something that you would have heard me say in previous videos is that there's a huge cultural crossover between Ireland, Scotland, England and Wales. More so with Scotland and Irish martial heritage, mainly down to the gallowglass and the Scottish influence into the north of Ireland, and obviously then throughout the rest of the island. So there's a lot of cultural crossover between the weapons. I have seen some theories that this is even a weapon with more of a background in the Viking sacks. Don't really tend to agree with that myself, although there is more than likely some sort of cultural crossover with that as well. The other thing with the skein as well is that while you see it a huge amount, you don't really have many finds of these. So off the top of my head, I think there's about 6 or 7 that I can think of. I'll show a few on screen now. But the interesting thing with the skein is that it pops up in artwork constantly. So as you'll see from some of the upcoming slides here, it is constantly seen in artwork. It is worn by almost every kind of warrior. So to me, this is kind of the Irish sidearm of choice. Now, the interesting thing about the skein is that it's not a sword and it's not really a knife. It's kind of like the dagger slash big knife or long knife, as you might say in the German tradition, or Langmesser. And I think it kind of falls into that category because it's not quite a knife. Like, you can't really comfortably use this for doing things. That was kind of why I wanted to test it. The smaller size, to me, those are very much in line with like a Bowie or a large hunting knife. Like this I could use for stuff, when camping. I can actually chop, it's got a good thick spine so I could batten wood, as well as fighting with it. Like, this is a good big knife that you could do a lot with if you needed to. But I wouldn't really risk doing any sort of batoning or kind of day-to-day bushcrafting tasks or something like this. This is very much a tool for war. As you can see from that long thin edge, I very much think these are primarily a thrusting weapon. You can cut with these, and if you're interested, let me know in the comments if you want me to see, or if you would like to see me do some testing with this. if that's something that you'd like to see, we'd be more than happy to do a video on it. But when it comes to the use of these, interesting enough, there is a posture that you'll see that appears very, very regularly, which I'll show now. So as you can see, that posture is this. So basically the blade held in a reverse grip with the finger on top like this. This appears a lot, and it's quite interesting. So one thing that you'll see as well in the artwork, which I find very, very, very interesting, is that these are more often than not worn on the right hip. So you would think commonly, if you're drawing a dagger across yourself or a long blade, so you will see in some of the artwork now that often they are worn on the left hip, when worn in conjunction with a spear or a polearm. Yet there is plenty of artwork where you see it actually worn on the right hip. So to me, that kind of lends credence to this, that you raise the blade up out of this posture and kind of do downward thrusting. Now obviously there's no manuals or manuscripts or anything like that on how these are used, but that is something that does appear quite a bit, is this downward kind of ice pick grip with the finger on top. I think it is very interesting to see. And one thing also that came up through some discussions on these as well, which I found very interesting, on the Wild Irish page on Facebook, WILDE. Also, I really recommend checking out their blog. Some amazing, fantastic resources on 15th and 16th century Irish. Is that there's references to Scottish dirks being used in a similar fashion. I'm actually show you a picture of that now. But one thing that you'll see that's done is that it's actually used along the left arm, almost like a kind of shield or parrying device. And this is something that I think, well, obviously we have images of it being used, but I think it's something that would make a lot of sense in the Irish context, because these were used a lot and these were very popular. But you'll also see fellas with ring pommel swords with these. Now, the thing that we kind of get a little bit, I don't know if wrong would be the right word, but the thing that we kind of get a bit focused in on is the fact that in 16th century Ireland we were still using much earlier weapons. So we were still using what, essentially were arming swords, and people were using rapiers. Rapiers were definitely here, but they weren't the in-fashion sword. And the interesting thing about that is that you would have had a lot of people using rapiers here. So they were definitely here, they were definitely being used. You would have had back swords and all sorts of other complex hilt weapons too. But that also meant a lot of people using offhand weapons. Rapier and dagger, everyone who's kind of seen movies like Alatrice, great example of it. Offhand daggers were used a lot. So a theory that I have is that these would have been carried by a lot of Irish people, but a lot of Irish people would have also had a sword, or Irish warriors, kerns. And it kind of makes sense that this might have been used as an offhand weapon in conjunction with a ring hilt or ring pommel sword. But from all the references I've seen of how the ring pommel sword was used, it was generally in wide sweeping motions, which doesn't really lend to thrusting. Now, obviously you can most definitely thrust with it, but it doesn't really work in the same way that rapier and dagger works, where you're keeping the weapon long, you're thrusting with both, and it kind of aids itself to a long outreach stance. And having it on the forearm when you're doing large sweeping motions allows for blocking, but also obviously allows for those downward thrusts. So it's an interesting thing to think about. And in the context of Scottish weapons, it also makes a lot of sense when you're using a broadsword, Scottish claymore, for those who like the term, where you're doing more circular motions rather than more regular thrusting motions. It does kind of make sense to have an offhand weapon that can be used for that, should something be missed and should you need the block, but also still aids itself in thrusting. So another interesting thing with these as well is, thanks to the artwork, we have 3 really nice examples of how these were worn. It's always a big question when it comes to daggers and offhand weapons, is how are they carried, how are they worn? And there seems to be kind of 3 primary types, or 3 primary ways that these are worn. So one is basically kind of string looped through a belt already existing at the waist. The other is on a purpose-built waist, or purpose-built belt I should say, for around the waist, or the other is a baldric, so going up and over the shoulder. And it's very interesting to see all three examples. Something I do plan on testing out to see how they were worn and what they like to carry. The other interesting thing with these as well is, even though the examples that we have are quite plain, and I think part of that is probably due to a lot of these, I think, may or may not have been made here. So, well, may or may not. I think quite a few would have been made here. And as a result, I think a lot of the blades were quite plain and quite simplistic as a result. We didn't really have a large-scale manufacturing industry like you might have had in Germany, say. But I think as a result, a lot of the blades are quite plain. But you do have a lot of very complex hilts on these. Not complex in baskets or anything like that, but very ornamented. One thing you do see a lot, which I would love one day to get, is these spiral designs, which I'll show now. You get these appearing on quite a lot of these. Very interesting kind of spiraled design, and also quite a lot of heavily carved handles. So the two examples I showed earlier of how these were worn, you also see these figures carved into the handles of these as well. So obviously a lot of interesting detail went into adorning these and making these look a little less plain. And it also kind of makes you think that these were most likely worn by all tiers of society, so not just the upper class. For example, quite often we see more so the rondel dagger being worn by upper class people in Europe, mainly because it's associated with knights and men-at-arms, because it's kind of a weapon of war, but also we do then start to see very ornamented versions of these. So that is kind of a brief overview of the skein and what it is and what it does. If you'd like to see me testing out the Tod Cutler version, let me know. And if you have any questions, please do let me know. I really do think these are a fascinating weapon, and one that's really, really ignored in my opinion. Unfortunately, we don't have any records of how they were used, but we do have some insights in our work as to how maybe they were used at the time, and some later references to similar knife styles to kind of give us a bit of an insight. So I do think they're really fascinating. We can get between the months. I'm going to be bringing these out into the field and kind of seeing how they work, how they handle. So do stay tuned for those. If you have any questions on them or anything you'd like to know, let me know. And if you're interested in trying out a class with myself, links will be below in the description. So really appreciate watching, guys. Please give us a old like and subscribe. It does really help. The channel's starting to grow, and the more support we get and the more this gets shared, the more videos we can do and the more interesting things I can start to put out there. So I appreciate your being here, and I appreciate you watching, and thanks once again, and so on.